The single silk button, a knot of deep crimson thread, rested just below the hollow of her throat. Jude Callahan's gaze kept falling to it, a small, perfect detail on the sea of red silk that was her wedding dress. His hand, wide and calloused from leather reins and the checkered grip of a Colt, felt like a clumsy piece of lumber near the fine fabric. He had seen his share of finery in saloons from Cheyenne to Sacramento, but nothing like this. It was a dress that spoke a language he didn't know, of tradition, and a world away from the dust and grit of Redemption Creek, Montana. This was the source of the trouble. This dress and the woman wearing it, Leanne. He had met her in her father's laundry, a small, clapboard building wedged between the blacksmith and the assay office. He'd gone in to collect a shirt, expecting the usual stoic silence from her father. Instead, Leanne had been there, her hands deftly folding linen, a quiet grace in her movements that seemed to calm the very air in the room. He had found himself making excuses to return, bringing in clothes that weren't particularly dirty, just to exchange a few words with her. Her English was careful, precise, and her smile was a rare thing, a small, private gift that made his chest ache. Now she was to be his wife, and his world was about to break in two. The sound of a buggy rattling to a stop outside his small cabin pulled him from his thoughts. It was too fast, too aggressive. He knew who it was before the carriage door slammed shut. His father did not arrive anywhere quietly. Jude moved to the doorway, placing himself between the room and whatever was coming. Leanne's dark eyes met his, and he saw, not fear, but a deep, knowing stillness. She had been expecting this too. Bartholomew Callahan stood in the yard, a man carved from the same hard rock as the mountains that loomed over their valley. His suit was dark, his face was set like stone, and his presence seemed to shrink the patch of land Jude called his own. Beside him, clutching a parasol like a weapon, was Jude's sister Clara. Her face was a mask of pinched fury. "Jude." His father's voice was not a greeting, it was a summons. "We need to speak. Alone." Jude didn't move from the doorway. "Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of my wife." The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Wife. Clara made a sound, a small gasp of outrage. "You haven't done it yet. There's still time to come to your senses." "My senses are just fine, Clara," Jude said, his voice low and even. He had learned long ago that raising his voice to his father was like shouting at a boulder. It changed nothing. Bartholomew's eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, flickered past Jude to the figure in red standing in the cabin's shadows. He did not acknowledge her. He looked back at his son. "You know what this means. You know the talk in town. A Callahan's name means something in this territory. It stands for decency, for respectability." "Leanne is a respectable woman," Jude stated. It was a simple fact, but in that moment it felt like a declaration of war. "She is a foreigner," Clara spat, stepping forward. "Her people live in shanties by the railroad tracks and speak in a language no God-fearing man can understand. They are not our kind, and you are bringing one of them into our family." "She is my family now," Jude said. The finality in his tone seemed to strike his sister silent for a moment, but it was his father who delivered the blow he'd been preparing. "If you marry her," Bartholomew said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout, "you are no longer a Callahan. The name, the ranch, the inheritance, all of it is gone. You will be on your own, with nothing but the name you've made for yourself with that gun on your hip." He paused, letting the weight of the threat settle. "And you know what kind of name that is." It was a cruel, calculated strike. Jude's reputation as a gunslinger was something he'd never wanted, a shadow that had followed him since a dispute over cards in a boomtown went bad. He'd been faster, and that had saved his life but cost him his peace. His father had always held it against him, another stain on the family name. Clara, sensing her moment, moved to her father's side. Her voice rose, shrill and wounded. "Can you not see what you are doing? To us? To Mother's memory? You're choosing her!" She pointed a trembling finger toward the cabin. "You are choosing her over your own blood!" Jude looked from his sister's furious face to his father's implacable one. He felt a profound and weary sadness settle over him. He had known this would be hard, but he hadn't understood the depth of their revulsion. He turned his head slightly and looked back into the cabin. Leanne had not moved. She stood straight and silent, her hands clasped before her, the red of her dress a defiant flame in the gloom. Her composure was its own kind of strength, a quiet anchor in the storm his family had unleashed. He turned back to face them, the hard summer sun beating down on his neck. He had made his choice weeks ago, in the quiet moments in the laundry, when he realized that Leanne's presence was the only thing that made the dust and noise of his life settle. "And I guess I'm on my own," he said. He did not yet know that the war had only just begun. The wedding was a spare, hurried affair in the cramped office of the territorial clerk. The man, a balding fellow named Abernathy, rushed through the words, his eyes darting toward the window as if expecting trouble. The only witnesses were Leanne's father, a man of immense dignity in a worn but clean coat, and an old prospector Abernathy had pulled in off the street. When the words were spoken and the paper signed, Jude felt a loosening in his chest, a sense of rightness that defied the storm gathering outside. He slid a simple gold band onto Leanne's finger. Her hand was cool and steady in his. He looked into her eyes and saw a flicker of something deep and warm, a promise that needed no words. But the moment they stepped out of the office and into the harsh sunlight of the street, the promise was tested. His father and Clara were there, waiting. They were not alone. A half-dozen of the Callahan ranch hands stood with them, men Jude had known his whole life. They were not armed for a fight, not with guns, but their presence was a show of force, a wall of disapproval. The few townsfolk on the street stopped to watch. It was a public spectacle, exactly as Bartholomew had intended. "So, it's done," his father said, his voice carrying down the boardwalk. "You've made your bed." "We have," Jude said, stepping slightly in front of Leanne. His hand instinctively fell to rest on the butt of his pistol. It was a habit he hated, but one that was hard to break. "This doesn't concern you anymore." "Everything a Callahan does concerns me," Bartholomew retorted. He took a step forward. "As of this moment, you are formally disinherited. The homestead you live on, the land I gave you, is Callahan land. You'll have 30 days to vacate." A murmur went through the small crowd. This was more than a family squabble. This was banishment. Jude's jaw tightened. The homestead was the only thing that was truly his, a piece of ground he'd cleared and built on with his own 2 hands. That land was a gift. "A gift to my son," Bartholomew said coldly. "A son I no longer have." Clara, emboldened by the public stage, stepped forward. She looked Leanne up and down, her lip curled in a sneer. "Look at her," she said to the onlookers, "hiding behind him like a painted doll. Does she even speak for herself?" Before Jude could answer, Leanne moved. She took a small, deliberate step out from behind him, her posture erect, her chin high. The red dress seemed to catch the sun, making her the undeniable center of the scene. The crowd fell silent. She did not look at Bartholomew or Clara. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the merchants, the wives, the drifters who had stopped to watch the drama unfold. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and carried in the sudden stillness. "In my homeland," she began, her English perfect, "we are taught that a man's honor is his most valuable possession. A man who honors his word is a good man." She paused, then her gaze shifted to Bartholomew. "A family that honors its son is a good family." The simplicity of the words was devastating. She wasn't pleading or defending herself. She was holding up a mirror to them, and the reflection was ugly. She had taken their accusations of being foreign and used the weight of her own ancient culture to judge them. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Clara's face flushed a deep, mottled red. She had expected tears or fearful silence, not this quiet, unassailable dignity. Bartholomew's eyes narrowed. He had lost control of the moment. Leanne had disarmed him with honor, a currency he claimed to value, but had just proven he lacked. He fell back on the one form of power he had left. "Words are cheap," he snarled, his voice low and venomous. "Let's speak of things that are real, like water." He pointed a finger not at Jude, but toward the distant hills where Jude's cabin sat. "That homestead is worthless without the water from the creek that feeds it, and the paper in my safe says that creek belongs to me, every drop. A piece of paper is a hard thing to argue with, son." The threat was absolute. He wouldn't just take the land, he would parch it. He would make it impossible for them to survive. Jude felt a cold dread creep into his gut. This was no longer about family pride. This was about destruction. Back in the small two-room cabin, the silence was thick with the residue of the confrontation. The late afternoon sun slanted through the single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Jude paced the length of the worn floorboards, his boots making a hollow, restless sound. He felt trapped, a caged animal. His father had boxed him in, using law and land and water as the bars of the cage. Leanne moved about the room with a quiet purpose that stood in stark contrast to his agitation. She lit the small stove, her movements economical and graceful. She measured tea leaves into a small clay pot, the faint, earthy scent slowly filling the tense air. Finally, Jude stopped his pacing. He ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry, Leanne," he said, his voice rough. "I'm sorry for what they did, for what they said. I should have known he would go this far." Leanne poured hot water over the leaves, then placed a lid on the pot. She turned to face him, her expression serene. "You have nothing to be sorry for. You stood by your word. You stood by me." "And for what?" he shot back, his frustration boiling over. "To lose everything? This land. This is all I have. He'll take it, Leanne. He'll choke us out. I brought you into this." "Yes," she said simply. "You did." She waited a beat, letting his anger crest and fall. Then she asked a question that cut through his turmoil. "Jude, why did you choose me?" The question caught him off guard. He looked at her, at the deep intelligence in her eyes. This wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine inquiry. He struggled to find the words. I don't know how to say it right. It's the way you are. Quiet. Kind. You made me feel..." He trailed off, unable to articulate the calm she brought to the chaos of his life. "I thought you needed protecting." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "I see." She gestured for him to sit at the small wooden table. She poured the tea into two small, handleless cups and pushed one toward him. "In my family," she said, her voice soft, "we do not mistake quiet for weakness." She told him about her grandfather in China, a scholar and a poet who had faced down warlords with nothing but ink and paper. She told him about her own father, who had arrived in California with nothing, enduring insults and threats to build a business that fed his family. "They threw rocks at his windows," she said, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her cup. "They told him to go back where he came from. Every day he would sweep up the broken glass, open his door, and greet his customers with a bow. He never raised his voice. He never raised his hand. He simply endured. He built his home on a foundation of patience. That is his strength. That is my strength. You did not choose weakness, Jude. You chose a woman whose family taught her how to stand." Her words reframed everything. He had seen her as a delicate flower to be shielded from the harsh winds of his world. He had not seen the roots, deep and strong, that anchored her. He had been so focused on his own fight that he had failed to recognize the warrior standing beside him. She rose and went to a small, lacquered wooden box she had brought with her. She opened it. Inside, nestled in velvet, was not jewelry or keepsakes, but a set of calligraphy brushes with ivory handles and a heavy black inkstone. They were old, worn smooth with use. "My grandfather's," she said, touching one of the brushes with a reverence that was almost palpable. "He believed that a clear mind and a steady hand could create a thing of beauty and truth that would outlast any sword. My strength is not in a gun. It is here, in remembering who I am." A knock at the door, sharp and official, shattered the moment. Jude was on his feet in an instant, his hand on his gun. He opened the door to find a man wearing the badge of a U.S. Marshal. "Jude Callahan?" the Marshal asked. He was an older man, his face weathered and tired. "I am. I have a legal notice for you." He handed over a folded piece of paper. "It's a formal challenge to your title on this homestead, filed by your father, Bartholomew Callahan. He's claiming the original grant was conditional. The circuit judge will hear it in the fall." It was real. The threat on the street had become a legal weapon. The Marshal looked from Jude's grim face to Leanne, who now stood in the doorway. He sighed, a sound of professional weariness. "Son," he said, lowering his voice, "I've known your father a long time. He's a hard man, but he's a proud one. If you were to reconsider your present arrangement, I expect this piece of paper would disappear." The offer was plain. Renounce his marriage, abandon his wife, and he could have his life back. The land, the name, the water. Jude didn't even have to think. He looked at Leanne, at the quiet strength that radiated from her, a strength he was only just beginning to understand. He looked at the calligraphy brushes in her box, tools of a different kind of power. He looked at the legal notice in his hand, a flimsy piece of paper against the weight of the promise he had made. He folded the paper and handed it back to the Marshal. "Tell my father the land can go to dust," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I'm not leaving my wife." The Marshal's expression was one of grim respect. He nodded slowly. "I figured you'd say that." He turned to leave, then paused on the step. "He also filed a claim on the water rights, son. Your well is on the boundary line, and his survey map says it's on his side. Summer's just getting started. It's going to be a long, dry one." 4 months later, the autumn air carried the sharp, clean scent of pine and coming frost. The aspen trees on the high slopes had turned a brilliant, trembling gold. The long, dry summer was over. Jude stood on the porch of his cabin, watching Leanne move through the rows of their sprawling garden. The ground that his father had tried to parch was thriving. It was a patchwork of late-season bounty, squash, pumpkins, and hardy greens. The water war had been the hardest part. Bartholomew had made good on his threat, legally barring Jude from the creek and the old well. For 2 weeks they had hauled water in barrels from a public spring 2 miles away, a back-breaking, spirit-crushing task. It was Leanne who had found the solution. She had spoken with the foreman of the Chinese crew that worked the railroad spur line. They were men her father had helped, men who understood what it was to be an outsider. They also knew a thing or two about digging. For a share of the harvest, they had come. For a week, they worked alongside Jude, their rhythmic chants a foreign but welcome sound in the small valley. They dug a new well, deeper than the old one, chasing a vein of groundwater they swore was there. When they finally hit the aquifer, the gush of cold, clear water felt like a miracle. It was their water, on their land, bought with sweat and community. Leanne had proven to be as resourceful as she was resilient. Her literacy, a rare skill in the shantytown, became a source of income. She helped other Chinese families write letters home, translate legal papers, and navigate the bewildering bureaucracy of the territory. They paid her what they could, in coin or barter. With that money, she bought seeds and tools. The garden was her victory, a testament to her quiet, unyielding will. Jude found his own way, too. He took a job guarding freight wagons for an independent freighter who disliked Bartholomew Callahan on principle. The man paid him a fair wage and respected him for the choice he'd made. The sound of an approaching rider drew Jude's attention. He was surprised to see it was his sister Clara. She rode alone, and she looked different. The proud, defiant set of her shoulders was gone, replaced by a weary slump. She looked thin, and there were new lines of worry around her eyes. She reined her horse in a dozen yards from the cabin, seeming uncertain. Jude walked out to meet her, Leanne joining him a moment later, wiping her hands on her apron. "Clara," Jude said. It wasn't a question or a welcome, just a statement of fact. Clara wouldn't meet his eyes. She stared at the thriving garden, at the smoke curling from the chimney of the well-built cabin. "Father," she began, her voice cracking slightly, "he's not well." She explained that Bartholomew's obsession with breaking Jude had consumed him. The legal fees had been immense. He'd borrowed against the ranch to pay them. The dry summer had been hard on his cattle, and his focus had been on his legal battle, not on managing his herd. Some of the hands had quit, tired of his sour, vengeful temper. The Callahan Ranch, once the jewel of the valley, was struggling. "He's a bitter man in a quiet house," she said, finally looking at him. Her eyes were filled with a misery that went beyond anger. "He won, you know. The judge sided with his survey. The old well is his." She gestured to their new well. "But you still have water. He won the battle, but I think he lost everything else." She swallowed hard. "We're short on provisions for the hands that are left. I came to ask to see if we could buy some of your vegetables to get us through to the next supply run." It was a complete surrender. The proud Callahan daughter, begging for scraps from the brother she had disowned and the foreign woman she had scorned. Jude looked at Leanne. Her expression was unreadable, but he saw no triumph in her eyes, only a quiet compassion. She nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "We won't sell them to you, Clara," Jude said. "We'll give them to you. Fill your wagon." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She nodded, unable to speak, and turned her horse around to fetch the wagon she'd left on the main track. The war was over, not with a gunshot or a courtroom verdict, but with an act of grace offered in a vegetable patch. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Jude watched his wife. She was mending one of his shirts, her needle moving with the same quiet precision she applied to everything. She wore a simple calico dress, not the magnificent red silk of their wedding day. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. Her fingers were no longer soft and smooth, but calloused from the garden, strong and capable. He thought of that first day, of the intricate silk button he had been so afraid to touch. He had seen it as a symbol of her fragility, of a world he had to protect her from. He had been wrong. The strength wasn't in the dress, or in his gun, or in the Callahan name. It had been in her, all along. She hadn't needed a protector. She had needed a partner. A man's family isn't always the one he's born into. Sometimes it's the one he's brave enough to build. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.